another episode of A Podcast. Your host, Stephen Maxted, and today we have Alex Stuart with Standard Carbon on with us today. And Alex, thanks so much for making time to join us today. I'm very passionate about what you guys are doing. I'm excited to chat more about it today and share the story. So let's start off with you sharing a little bit just about yourself and maybe high level what Standard Carbon is about. We'll go from there.
Absolutely. Stephen, appreciate you having me on. So Alex Stuart, I'm the CEO of Standard Carbon. We are a 5-year-old firm in the city doing some pretty awesome stuff. As for myself, it's live in Winnipeg and wife and 2 kids, 7 and 11 little girls. So that's been a lot of fun. And just, things are flying. So I'm more than happy to chat with you and your listeners.
Awesome. Now, what is Standard Carbon all about? Let's explain that to start off things.
Sure. So we started out life as an ISO-accredited greenhouse gas verifier, which is sort of a really fancy way of saying we have the PN stamp for environmental statements. So when an oil and gas company needs to make a report to Environment Canada, they need a third-party auditor to confirm the details of that report. We would go in and audit that. So we do a lot of that kind of audit work for oil and gas companies, some First Nations out in BC, and then some other sort of offset projects as well. So most of our work is in Canada and the US. We have done some work overseas, and most excitingly, because consulting and audit is fun, but is the software piece that we're building. So we're in the process of building the QuickBooks for Carbon, which is a small medium enterprise software solution for those folks that need to get their carbon footprint in a way that they can roll that up to their customers. So that really is kind of what gets me out of bed in the morning.
Absolutely. And that's super cool. So what parts of a company are you guys analyzing with like Standard Carbon in general? Like, is this everyday travel, or is it, only flights that you're kind of taking into account? And then how does like the offset side of it work in terms of calculating that part of the math there?
So we take the thesis that if you show me what you spend money on, I will show you your carbon footprint. So really the carbon footprint for a company is any expense that you would have. There's some kind of carbon footprint attached to that. Now, service companies obviously will have a lower carbon footprint. So the consulting work that we do, right, we can give somebody a carbon footprint for that. But really it's looking at sort of all their expenses. Now, it depends on what that company wants to report in terms of how you break that down. So you'd mentioned business travel. That's actually referred to as a scope 3 emission. So that's sort of anything that's outside of your direct control. So you don't own the plane, therefore those emissions are created by another company, but by you spending money on that thing, you then get those emissions for yourself. Scope 1 emissions would be putting fuel into company vehicles, for example. So that's stuff that's directly under your control. And then scope 2 is anything you buy from the utility.
Very interesting. Okay, so there's different like tiers to this process. And then how does the company have like offsets, or how do they, kind of have a positive on the other end of things? Because obviously you can see how they use them. Is there a way that they can kind of like counter that?
Yeah, so our software and sort of what we do really focuses on the carbon debt side of the ledger. So if you think of a climate ledger, you've got credits and debits. And so folks are familiar, or many folks are familiar with the term carbon credits. Technically, they're referred to as carbon offsets, but you'll hear me kind of flip back and forth between those two terms. And so a carbon credit is actually a fairly tightly controlled financial product, which intends on sort of bridging the gap between business as usual and something better. So for example, like if you switch from a gas vehicle fleet to an electric vehicle fleet, that reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in some cases can be captured and monetized. And then either you use that for your own climate ledger, or you're actually able to package that up and sell that to a third party. And so it intends on sort of accelerating decarbonization beyond just sort of business as usual. So that's what a carbon credit does. Now, the way a company would work with that is they would use our software to figure out their carbon footprint or their carbon debt. Here's what we owe the climate. and then they can go out and purchase carbon offsets to be able to offset that debt.
Very interesting. It's so great to hear you say that, because I think a lot of time on the news, like we get to hear carbon something, and then to actually like be like, hey, like what's going on here besides that check that once in a while gets sent out, to understand a little bit more behind the scenes directly there. Now, I guess this might not be specifically where you guys come into play, as you kind of mentioned there, but I guess on the other end of things, like there will be a point where people are selling kind of like the credit side of things to companies that are heavy users of carbon in the future. Is that kind of the concept here?
Yeah, so there's two main types of carbon pricing. And so the concept of carbon pricing, of putting a price on pollution, actually won the Nobel Prize in 2017 in economics as like prize worthy of like thinking. And so the idea being that if you put a price on carbon, that you actually push the capitalists and the environmentalists to the same side of the table. So the capitalists go, ooh, an expense, I don't like that, let's drive that down. And the environmentalists are going, yes, great. So where I'm going with this is that the two different types of carbon pricing is a carbon tax, which is what we have in Canada, and a cap and trade system. And so a carbon tax just kind of smears everybody with the same brush, and there's really not a lot of opportunity for innovation because you can't escape it. I mean, it's a tax. Whereas cap and trade says, okay, you're allowed to pollute this much. And if you pollute less than what you're permitted to pollute, you create potential credit there. Or there are other activities that you can do that create credits. And so if you're over what you're permitted to pollute, you then have to pay to purchase the credits to bring your account back into balance, with the intent of every year that cap goes down. So you cap the pollution, set up a system over the next X amount of time where that ratchets down. And then what that does is that creates that innovation for those companies who get rewarded for, say, investing in a different process or upgrading their building envelope or whatever they might happen to do. They can then recoup some of the money on that investment and turn around. And those companies that just refuse to do anything, eventually the financial pressures on those companies start to push to the point where they become less competitive. And ideally, even the hardest, hard-nosed capitalist is going to say, okay, fine, at some point I've got to play ball with this system. And so that's the intent of a cap and trade system.
That is really well explained. Thank you for walking through that. Now, I'll talk about the everyday person, like in terms of versus like a company versus an individual, for how much carbon emissions or carbon debt does the average person really take on in a year?
Super good question. So first, I like to say that carbon offsets are not fit for human consumption. And so it was actually a trick in environmentalism kind of 1.0 to make people think that the carbon footprint that they have is theirs, which is why they actually used the language carbon footprint. I don't know exactly which consulting group came up with it. It could have been McKinsey. But there was a consulting group that came up with this term back in the 80s or so, where they said, let's make it people's problem. So let's call it a carbon footprint, because businesses don't have feet. And so what's happened was that it tricked people into thinking that, okay, the stuff that I need to buy, that's my fault, right? Oh my gosh, I had to buy shoes, right? It's not. It is the business's problem and the business's fault because of the choices that business has made. And so, I mean, I can't look at my shoes and evaluate, a pair of shoes. I need stuff on my feet, right? I live in Winnipeg and it's winter, so I need to have stuff on my feet. Whereas those companies are making those choices in terms of what the carbon footprint for my stuff is going to be. And so environmentalism 2.0 is really focused now on the corporate carbon footprint. Now, don't get me wrong, there's lots of good stuff that individuals can do. And some folks are really motivated by their carbon footprint. I know folks that have ditched their vehicle and only use bikes and occasionally like a car co-op kind of thing. And that's awesome. But when you look at kind of the impact that an individual would have compared to the size of what some of these very large polluters are doing, it becomes meaningless, unfortunately, right? And that sounds super cynical, but what I want to do is really galvanize people to know that this is where we need to put the pressure. And that's what we're starting to see sort of regulations and stuff do, is to take the blame off of the individual and put it where it rightly belongs, which is on those corporations.
This might be a weird, silly comment that I'm about to make, but I had this realization when I was actually in, it's about plastic straws where this is going. And I was in Disney World last year, I want to say, roughly timeline, about a year ago. And I was like, for even our own city here in Winnipeg, I was just kind of doing like a visual take on all the plastic straws and all the plastic stuff within that park that day. And I was like, I bet that they burn through more in this one day than we probably do in an entire year as a city locally here. And it's just kind of in a perspective, mindset of like what you're saying. It's like good to do the little thing, but I'm like, there's other places out there that are just totally, and no knock on Disney. That's just, they got plastic down there. That's what they're using. So, and I know that they do lots of good out of that corporation too as a company, but they're definitely using lots of straws and cups in those days there. And it would really put it in perspective, right? There's I don't know how many people are there every day, but I'm sure there's hundreds of thousands of straws every week, month, millions in the year kind of thing, that are used there versus like the individual trying to, save that plastic straw that they're not using locally here. And so the same kind of concept would apply there, right? It's like, it's great to make those efforts, but these other places really need to be the ones that are leading and making those changes over time. So
for sure. And when you mentioned sort of straws, and we have to look at it in terms of sort of harm reduction and sort of the lesser of two evils, because so paper straws, which eventually sort of melt and become gooey and stuff like that, they actually coat those plastic straws with what's called PFAS, which I don't exactly know what the acronym stands for. Polyfluorinated. I don't know. Your listeners are probably going to jump all over this comment, but those forever chemicals actually end up in our bodies. And so by us switching from plastic to these paper, we've actually now introduced like terrible chemicals into our system. And so like the federal government in Canada, at least, is now really starting to regulate these things. Just again, it's well intentioned, but it's, again, I believe that it's misplaced. And so, and before I forget, actually, and I don't know sort of how you do your graphics and whatnot, but something that I always point to people when we talk about sort of the individual versus company, impact, that I always point them to is if you do a Google search for the Bakken oil field, Bakken oil field at night, you'll actually see, and this is in North Dakota, and you'll actually see a huge chunk of light where there's absolutely no people. And that is oil wells burning their methane. That chunk of light is actually bigger by yards to Winnipeg. And if you zoom out, you actually can see like Minneapolis, and this is more light from those burning oil fields from space than Minneapolis. So like the amount of pollution just in that one piece of oil field is absolutely staggering. And it really helps drive home the point that that's what we need to be targeting, rather than, blaming you for using plastic straws.
Yeah. Or kind of maybe on lighter end things, but like driving a vehicle, right? Versus, something like that can be very impactful. Interesting. Okay. So I know that we kind of circled around it a little bit, but if we were to look at, or I don't know if there is an answer for this necessarily, but an individual specifically, do we know how much carbon on average a person would, so to say, like use in a year? Or
yeah, good question. It really depends on which country you live in. Like in Canada, my footprint is way higher because I have to burn natural gas for heat, right? Whereas in other countries, and so like a car, and you'd mentioned that earlier, a car is about 5 tons worth of pollution every year.
Okay.
About, right? And again, that's going to vary wildly depending on the size of the vehicle. But if you think sort of 5 tons from that, and then you're looking at probably something similar in terms of like heating, space heating and stuff like that, because I'm going to go from a heated house to a heated office and work. Right. And so, I can't quote the exact numbers, but I know that Canada is one of the highest carbon footprint per capita. And really it's because of our winters.
Yeah. But have to be. You need that, right? We're not going to live in coats and be bundled up 24/7, so to say, like that. But no, it definitely makes sense. I guess geography would have a big play in that. Where's like, I guess on the lighter end of things though too, you would think it would maybe be in like a hotter country, but they also have like air conditioners which need to pull electricity and different things like that. And I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's always
Which will
going to
depend on, like, it'll depend then on the energy source. And so something that a lot of folks don't necessarily know or realize is that island countries, so like stuff in the Caribbean, they're all diesel powered. So, and like they bring tankers in almost every day. They're hidden from the tourists, like you don't see them.
Yeah.
And the where they drop their fuel off is like out in the ocean. So even if you did see a tanker, you wouldn't think that that tanker is feeding into the island. And so, yeah, in cases like that, you run the air conditioner in, an island, country that is all running, chugging off of a diesel generator. So, there's lots of opportunity. And I think, and this is something that I often tell, like, so we have some younger staff in the office and they can get pretty sort of down about this. And I say, look, we have solved the problems. We just need to connect the dollars, because it's really just a case of how are we going to pay for this? And there will be winners and losers in this. And so it's a case now of making sure that we push the dollars for a variety of different mechanisms into the solutions, because there's been a lot of really smart people working on this for quite a long time, at everything from like the small scale to the very big scale, and like how do we take carbon out of the atmosphere to sort of fix what we've already put up there. And so the solutions are out there, and there's more coming online all the time, which is probably my favorite part of this job, is to kind of be at the front row of all the neat stuff that's changing to sort of fix this problem. But again, it takes dollars, and where are they going to come from, and how do we get the dollars to the right spot to fix this?
Awesome. It's so cool to hear you talk about that. I can tell, even in very light conversation, you hear how passionate you are about this as a project. And how did this get started for you, Alex?
Great question. So this business really kind of came into its own when I was having a conversation with the CEO of the American Accounting Association. And so we were part of an accelerator program for accounting technology. And in a conversation with him, he said, Alex, the carbon offsets that you're working on and the technology that we were working on at the time and that we had patented, he said, that's really interesting stuff and valuable. And that'll be an important part of our future. But right now, we as accountants are getting called on to start to do this kind of work. And there's no way that I can educate 300,000 accountants in the States with the kind of environmental knowledge that they need. And when I had asked him, if I made software that translated that environmental expertise that we have and turned it into financial language so that you guys can do what you do as accountants, would that be valuable to you? And the look of relief on his face was that aha moment. I'm like, okay, the light bulb's gone off. This guy has clearly, expressed to me in like emotional terms that we need to translate this from EnviroSci into financial language, because there's just not enough environmental scientists and like practitioners like us or auditors that can do this, but there's lots and lots and lots and lots of accountants. And so if we can help arm them to do this stuff, because if carbon now has a price, that means it touches $1, which means it touches an accountant, because that's what their job is. But they don't have the skill sets to be able to kind of manage that. And so that's really what we've been focused on, is that kind of alchemy to turn environmental stuff into financial language.
Very cool. So within the software, and this might be a little too of a micro thing, but is it basically analyzing, like, looking on my desk here for a receipt, but basically it's taking like the product that's kind of on there as well, and being like, hey, this product is this much carbon. Is that a weird way to say that? Like, obviously we know with travel, like, okay, a flight, there's probably, that one is probably seemingly like an easier one to do. But if you're just getting like a product from there, I order something from Amazon, how does it kind of start to work and pick that invoice apart that I've kind of have?
Yeah. So funny enough.
Okay. Eureka.
and so like what happens from a finance point of view is that, a receipt will come into a business and then that goes into their financial system. So like, let's say QuickBooks, for example, which is the biggest accounting platform. So not picking on them, but so the whoever it is that's doing that data entry will push that information into their accounts. And then that ultimately lines up with the bank account or the credit card, right? So they can see, okay, we spent this money here. We can see it come out of the bank account here. Everything kind of connects. What we do is we'll capture that information as it's coming in on a receipt, and we can extract the information that we need. So the one that I actually just pulled out of my pocket was a gas receipt from this morning. So what you would put it in the books as saying, okay, here's the vendor, here's the date, here's the price, but you wouldn't record the amount of fuel, right? There's no reason to record that. That's not relevant to the business. We would come in and grab that receipt, look at the liters of fuel, see what kind of fuel it is, gas versus diesel, and then be able to do a calculation on that and say, okay, for your spend of X, it now has a Y carbon footprint attached to that. And so we can kind of bolt on the carbon footprint to any expenditure that a company is making.
Very interesting. And then, okay, so gas is an easier one there. And I guess where this is probably going is that, like, let's say I do order something online, it comes to the house. I, as the consumer, am not really the one that's, like you were saying before, would have that carbon footprint. That company would have that carbon footprint from whatever product that is. Me driving to the store and spending gas on that in that vehicle or whatever is my carbon footprint, so to say. But that company who made the product, that's theirs. They're responsible for that. Like, I go to IKEA, I go get I don't know, a nightstand, a bookshelf, something like that. That's on them for doing that. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea behind like climate accounting, because it's about trying to figure out where that carbon footprint ultimately rests. And when you look at a company's carbon footprint, 80% of their emissions come from their supply chain. So really it's about what vendors you're selecting. So like, where's IKEA sourcing their wood or their glue to make the press board or anything like that, right? So it's about the choices that they're making. And one of the things, and this might be kind of counterintuitive, but I believe that with carbon pricing, we're actually going to see the greatest amount of onshoring and nearshoring of manufacturing that ever, because you take that carbon piece out. Because once you price carbon, it erodes the financial leverage that overseas manufacturing has, right? Because they can claim that they have lower labor costs, but their electricity is more dirty, and then you have to put it on a boat and get it over here. So once you factor that piece in, it's no longer as financially advantageous to do that overseas manufacturing. Now, there will definitely be times and places where that still holds true, but generally speaking, I can see, as carbon pricing sort of starts to take hold, that we're going to start to see those supply chains become way more efficient and probably a little bit more regional, which is not necessarily bad, because then it's local jobs and all that kind of stuff. And sort of, I'm going to jump off my soapbox in a second here, but one of the questions that I get asked is sort of the political risk that we face. And so governments change, right? So we're seeing a new US administration. In Canada, we've got a friendly administration to climate right now. They may end up getting replaced with one that's not as, progressive. And so, we get the question, right? Like, what are these impacts going to have on us? And it's a bigger picture than just the politicians. Like, it's the genie's out of the bottle, right? Like, the younger generations are demanding this stuff now, and companies are responding to that. So it's not like, it doesn't even matter what government is in power, because the company knows that their consumer is wanting this stuff and is going to start to vote with their dollar about, the prices or the products that they purchase. So I think it's a little insulated from that. I think you're going to see a little bit of sort of back and forth on the margins of the policy, but in terms of like big picture, we're moving in that direction right now, regardless.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make about like products being made overseas, and then that part of it being like an advantage right now, but in the future it may not be. What would be, and I don't know if you know this, Sean, but like getting kind of more micro on the topic, like what's a really high carbon product that people use today that they might not expect or suspect it to be?
Beef has a really high carbon footprint that would be kind of unexpected. Actually, some medicines, surprisingly, have a pretty high carbon footprint attached to them. And honestly, like a lot of our food
Okay.
Like bananas, like the fact that we can get a banana for like 69
That's
cents a pound, right? Like someone's losing money somewhere because
yeah.
there's just no way that you can get that banana here for that kind of price. And
Yeah.
so, but like we don't grow bananas in Winnipeg, so they're
Very
coming
true.
from somewhere. And so those are the kinds of things that would have a way higher carbon footprint than you would otherwise think.
What about something that's lighter, like lettuce? Because it takes up space. We still have to use the truck to get it here. It's not like a heavy product, but something like that, what kind of carbon footprint does that product carry with it?
I haven't looked like down the grocery aisle at each
Yeah,
individual sort of piece there.
yeah,
But yeah, that's it. Honestly, like next time you're at the grocery store, like when you're
yeah,
buying the fruits or vegetables, look at
yeah,
the country of origin, right? Like
right,
you will be shocked sometimes where you're like, you pick this thing up and you're like, Guatemala, like,
yeah,
wow, right? And that's, I mean, a testament to our supply chain. But
right,
and before I leave the supply chain thing,
yeah,
ketchup, when you manufacture ketchup, it crosses the US, that tomato crosses the US like over 10 times, zips back and
interesting.
forth to like, okay, gets grown over here and then picked and then like, shipped over here to get peeled and then over there to get colored and then over there to get sugared. Like the thing just zips around across the country 10
Yeah.
times to make ketchup.
Well, and the thing that just popped in my head here was like I've seen, and I can't remember the fruit. Let's say it's peaches. I don't know if it was or not. Maybe it was oranges or something. And it was like it showed like produced here, packaged here, and then went back somewhere there. Like it was like South America, then went over to like Asia or something, and then to Canada, and it just made no sense. It was like, yeah, produced here, packaged there. And if you draw that on a map, it really makes no sense. Like on an extreme version of kind of what you mentioned there about the tomatoes, less stops, but very big stops nonetheless, right? Like, how does that make sense? Like, so it's good that you guys are working on stuff like this to help correct that thought process because obviously that could be done closer to the source somewhere. There's got to be something that could be improved there for the logistics. You're not shipping this thing on a freight boat across the ocean twice.
And it only makes sense right now because you don't pay that part carbon price, right? Like that. And so therefore it makes financial sense for whatever reason to do that, right? But as soon as you
Yeah.
have that piece of carbon pricing, now suddenly that business is like, wait a second, this doesn't line up anymore. We have to make some other kind of change.
Yeah. Well, and it just seems silly. And it's good that, yeah, then this tax will be involved in there and then it'll help, yeah, orchestrate that. You can definitely see, I guess sometimes it's tough to get things up north to northern communities in Canada. So that's probably not the best example of, a positive carbon situation. But we do have lots of trees in Canada. And I know I've heard other people talk about how much forest we have and how much space that takes up. How does that get kind of brought into the picture in the fold here for things that are either crops on the farmer side of things? I mean, they're seasonal, but then forests in general, or if companies have purchased forests, is that like an advantage for them at some point? Like, do we count trees in the mix of things?
So on the northern piece,
Yeah,
I know they're working on bringing the carbon footprint of that down because in that case, carbon is directly tied to price, right? Irrespective of the carbon pricing, it's just the carbon represents the fuel to get it up there, right? And so there's a very real motivator to try and figure out how to decrease that. I know they're working on a lot more regional, like food security and stuff like that, like having containerized greenhouses and stuff like that. So there's a lot of really good work going, and that's really, frankly, more for community health, like people to have fresh food and stuff like that, which is way better for their health. And so I know they're actively working on that. Now, when it comes to sort of the trees and the farms and all that kind of stuff, it's really good to think about sort of again, carbon as on a ledger, right? So what adds to the atmosphere and what takes it out of the atmosphere. And so in Canada, right, obviously the forests are, the tree takes the carbon dioxide, puts the carbon in its body to grow, and then gives us the oxygen, right? It literally takes CO2 and cuts the C from the O2, gives us back the O2 and uses the C for itself. And so you've got a huge carbon sink in Canada's forests. The problems come from that The boreal forest, so like the vast majority of forest in Canada, not all of it, but a lot of the forest is boreal, requires fire in order to rejuvenate, right? So like pine cones need fire to be able to spread their seeds. And so what we're seeing actually is that like the amount of forest fires in Canada, I think it was something like 4 times the country's emissions from forest fires last year. So like to put that in perspective, all of Canada's economic activity, burning natural gas, driving vehicles around, stuff like that, all of that economic activity, 400% more came from forest fires.
Wow.
So again, right, we're looking at it and going, okay, well, you should drive an electric vehicle. Well, hold on a second. Let's figure out forest fires better, because as far as a planetary impact goes, there's a bigger piece there. And then when we get into the ag side of things, like ag can get really vilified, and the current federal administration announced like we want a 35% reduction in emissions from ag, and that went over like a lead balloon, because all of the emissions in agriculture comes from fertilizer. And so these farmers were like, you want me to use less fertilizer and grow less food so that I make less money and your food costs more. Like, this doesn't make any sense at all, right? And so it wasn't a really well thought out sort of policy statement. There are lots and lots of things that farmers can do that decrease the carbon footprint, which then means that they're spending less on fertilizer or less on fuel, right? So there is a cost savings there, but it's not how it's being put forward. It's like, you farmers make pollution bad, punish you, right? Not like, how do we as a government support you guys? Here's the solutions, here's the technology, or maybe there's tech that hasn't been invented yet, right? Like, I know they're working on self-driving tractors, right? Humanless tractors that can just go out and do it all, and electric as well. So it's about sort of creating the economic environment where those innovations can sort of get traction.
Interesting. Yeah, that's, never knew that about forest fires. And it's part of the cycle, obviously, like you said too. You kind of need that to happen, unfortunately, to do that. But if you could figure a way to better solve that, that would be back to like the plastic straw situation of Disney World, almost in a way, right? Like, figure out those bigger situations of things. But it's kind of funny because, sorry.
I was just sorry to jump in there.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, and this is one of those places where like Indigenous sort of wisdom and sort of stewardship of the land, we can learn something from, because they used to start forest fires on purpose to manage this, right? And so they would know when the wind was coming from any whatever given direction, and then they would start a fire, and that fire would basically go through and clear out the underbrush. And so it wouldn't necessarily torch the whole forest, because so one of the things that's happened is, because we've gotten really good at like stamping down on forest fires, it's allowed so much deadfall to accumulate. So like pine needles and fallen trees and all that kind of stuff, right? And that just creates a whole bunch of fuel that when a fire comes through, the whole friggin' thing goes up, right? Whereas they like historically, like ancient times, right? They would manage their land and actually get fire to go through in order to sort of clear a lot of that stuff out and rejuvenate the forest, because now you've got space for new trees to grow, because otherwise it was just leaves and stuff like that. So I think there'd be a tremendous amount of, again, things that we can learn and techniques that we can apply that would have sort of really far-reaching impacts. I'm not a forest expert, but I know that was something that I heard and went, they used to light forest fires on purpose, but it wasn't like what we think of as a forest fire, right? It was a managed process, and they had just learned over time that it's better to have a little forest fire than a big one.
That's so interesting. No, I'm glad that you shared that story there. I had no idea that was a thing. One of the things, I guess, within like, trees, what we're talking about, this kind of thing there, it's weird to see come back in, is years ago, I remember there being paper bags, and then we went plastic because it was helping trees, and now we're back to paper bags again. And it's kind of a unique cycle that way. And there's some complaints, and some people like it, whatever, they don't. But that's an interesting one to observe in terms of like, hey, like what's a better thing here actually? Because in some cases, I know I've made the comment too, like those bags would get like 3 different uses. They get used to garbage bag at home instead of me going and buying a bag. Yeah, it's getting used for that, or picking up dog poop. It's a common one. I know a lot of folks, but now they sell their own bags that are, biodegradable and stuff. But, I wonder how many other things like that are going to rinse, recycle, repeat for, hey, gotten rid of it over time there. It's just an interesting thing to observe, I guess. We'll see if plastic bags make a comeback or not.
I think where it's going to go is, again, from an innovation point of view, is that we're going to see a lot more bioplastics, like stuff that looks like plastic, but that actually, biodegrades. Like they can actually make plastic from hemp, which is wild. So there's parts of the hemp plant that you can extract, and again, I don't know exactly how they do it, but they can make plastic from that. And so, and hemp is absolutely insane as a plant. Like they've got plants that'll be as big as your thumb and 17 feet tall. Like just wild in terms of what these plants can do. And so I hope we're going to see the innovation say, look, we want the advantages that plastics have for all this stuff that we love plastic bags and plastic straws for, without that sort of negative impact. We don't have to dig up dinosaurs. We're going to turn it into a straw, right? Yeah. So I think we're going to see a lot of that kind of stuff, because now as a consumer, I'm looking at this going, well, I'm going to pick that, right? Yeah. And especially if the price point is such that it's a wash, you're going to have all those conveniences without those necessarily those negative impacts. So, don't quote me on that. Like I don't know of a product that's coming to market for that, but that would be my expectation. And those multi-use plastic, or whatever they're called now, like the grocery totes and stuff like that, are absolutely horrific for the environment. Like, frankly, like I will go to the grocery store and just not get bags. Like, and so there's sometimes I'm walking out of there like just loaded. But I can usually make a cashier laugh, because they'll ask and I'll be like, no, we're in a post bag world. Like, I don't believe in bags anymore. Right. That usually gets a chuckle out of them.
That's so funny. Good for you. And it's interesting to hear that too. I definitely think that stuff like that would make a ton of sense in terms of made from biodegradable products, or like you were saying, like hemp. Familiar enough with that plant to understand from the egg side, like it grows quite literally like a weed, and that's kind of funny name that comes along with the cannabis side of that business. But very cool. And what about stuff within the company and coming up for you guys? What's going on behind the scenes? I know you guys are located in Winnipeg, but obviously this can be, I assume, international just by nature of it being easy to apply to other things. But yeah, where's the company heading? Where are you guys at right now?
So we actually, I'm really focused on Singapore right now, which kind of sounds random, but the Singapore Stock Exchange passed a regulation that requires sort of the kind of reporting that our software is perfectly married for. And so so that's one place that we're really exploring right now. I'm having some conversations with folks over there, which is super cool. And then there's some domestic firms as well that we're just sort of starting some partnerships with. We're going to be getting our pilot project going. The software product itself will be launching beta testing at the end of January. And then we'll be actually launching to the public for our sort of that initial product launch, probably sometime mid Q2. So we're actually going through an equity raise right now. So if anybody's interested in getting a hold of us, that would be great. But we are certainly looking for some investment just to grow the team and to be able to sort of do stuff faster. And so it's really exciting times for us. It's been quite the journey, but knowing in sort of the classic Wayne Gretzky, right, skate to where the puck is going, it feels like we're kind of getting a lot closer to that point where we had predicted years ago would kind of happen. And so we started skating as hard as we could in that direction. And it just kind of looks like that timing is proven to be pretty good. Again, there's business, right? So there's ups and downs and twists and turns and whatnot, but it's a really good feeling to see that, and knowing that we can sort of be on the side of doing good and ideally making money, and knowing that those sort of two things can align in a way that is meaningful and impactful. I certainly know that for a lot of our staff, that means a big thing for them, which is also sort of fun to see because we can celebrate those wins, not just from a, hey, look at, the money. It's more like, look what the impact is going to be, right? And so you can kind of get excited about both and not feel bad in any way.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, what's a way that a good way to follow the journey or the story for Standard Carbon going forward? We have a website, on social medias, and
yeah, we're on the socials. So if you look for standardcarbon.ai or climateaccounting.com. So standardcarbon.ai is going to be the consulting side of the business, and then the climate accounting is all of the software piece. So LinkedIn is probably the cleanest way to follow us. We do, we will post there. It's a little bit harder on some of the other socials, and especially because like our customer base isn't necessarily there, right? Like we are focused on selling to like accountants, and so there are actually like accounting groups on Insta and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And they share accounting memes and all kinds of stuff, but like the most part, right? Like because it's a business to business solution, that's sort of where we focus our efforts.
No, that totally makes sense. No, that's good to mention that in case someone's listening. We'll have the links attached below here for website and any socials that do exist. So
thank you very much.
Yeah, that's what's so you mentioned like Q1, Q2. What's the next like 5 years out look like for you guys, and how big of an impact is this gonna have?
So the goal is that we can integrate with any accounting platform out there. There's sort of ways to build the software that kind of can hover on the side and just grab the information that we need to do our work. And so the intent would be to get to the point where we are enabling companies to add carbon to their vendor selection process. That's sort of the real ultimate goal, is that once a company can report to somebody at a product level to say, like, if I shipped you a pallet of this, here's the carbon footprint for that. And then a company can evaluate a vendor. Again, they're going to evaluate based on price and quality, like all the other vendor selection stuff. What we want to do is we want to add carbon to that consideration, so that companies can now start to make decisions supply chain wise in terms of where they're sourcing stuff from. And again, if it's one manufacturer in Turkey that they're the only ones in the world that make whatever it happens to be, like, your hands are tied, right? You still have to purchase that. But a lot of other stuff could be sourced in different places. And so that's kind of the real main overarching theme for what we're after, is to be able to, we want to be the plumbing that enables this information to kind of flow back and forth between companies, which doesn't sound super exciting, but being part of that infrastructure really would have a huge impact, and of course, allow our business to be really successful as well.
No, I think that's awesome. That's a great recap and a great goal to have too. I think it is going to have a huge impact, and excited for a 2.0 of this already, for us to chat in the future and see how big of an impact you guys have had.
Awesome.
On things. So Alex, I just want to say thank you so much again for making time to be on here and sharing your story and Standard Carbon and climate accounting with us today on a podcast. So thanks for the time, and we'll keep in touch.
Thanks very much. Take care.